ALV events. Please be present, take notes, ask questions. This is your time. The other thing that people actually don't know that's available to them is typically your employer, the organization that you work with, has access and budget for personal development. Your path to getting coaching easily accessible to you is just to ask for professional development budget and make the case as to why you want a coach. And that way you can invest in a coach and have your organization sponsor you for it. We have an article on how to do that, which we'll share in a follow-up email of how to ask your employer for professional development budget. So I highly recommend that you do that so that you can take the things that we're talking about today and put it into practice in your everyday world. This is my favorite where everyone's like, oh, I want to hear all the feedback you have. And then as soon as someone gives us feedback, we get really defensive about it. I've done this 100 times. I always say, I want feedback. Yes, tell me. And then when someone gives me that feedback, it's a huge ego punch. It's a gut. It hits you in the gut and you get really upset about it. And then you start to explain or defend why you did what you did. So there's so many different parties involved, even in the process of feedback, let alone delivering the feedback conversation, is ultimately we get really defensive around it. And that's natural because we don't like to be wrong about something. We don't like to mess up. And so when we hear something we don't like, our natural thing is to get really upset by it. And we're going to talk about how to not do that too. 30% or 60%? How many of you think that 30% of people actually get feedback versus 60% are getting the feedback? %30 of people in reality are asking for feedback, yep, and are not getting it. And that's the funny part, is that everybody's asking for feedback, but don't get it. So only 30% of people actually get the feedback that they're looking for. And on top of that, if we think about why people leave organizations, one of the top few reasons is because they did not get what they were looking for to be better. They did not get what they were looking for to be better. You get what you need to be better through a form of feedback. So if you don't give it, you probably are also going to have high turnover with the people that you work with. And that's just that it's one of those things where we can control it. We just have to also make sure that we're doing it in a way that makes sense. Just kind of a quick overview of what we're going to be going through. There's our relationship with feedback, which is important to understand. And then also just understanding the feedback process, the framework, and then the delivery of it. I'd love to know. Feel free to go off mute if you want, and or put in this chat. When was the last time you returned your food? Maybe let's talk about pre-COVID, when we were actually freely going to restaurants. When was the last time you were able to return your food? For whatever reason it was.
And you probably didn't have time to read through the whole thing, so that's fine.
People typing in the chat? When I've typically asked this question.
Years ago, never, too uncomfortable. My response is I rarely return my food as someone from the restaurant industry. 2 years ago. So it's been a while.
Been a while. Most of us fall in the it's been a while and or have never done it unless it's a life or death situation where it's like, oh, I'm allergic, so therefore I'm going to say something because my health is at risk. And or I'll just buy something else and I won't say anything because we feel uncomfortable. And imagine this is something you're paying for. This is something that you're going to eat and ingest. And if you don't like it, you'd rather do that than to just tell someone, I don't like it. This little thought by something else. Yep. This thing right here, this is the basis of where it starts with our feedback and our relationship with it. Because if we cannot do something for ourselves, how can we expect that we're willing to deliver difficult news if we're giving constructive feedback to somebody else about something else that they're doing? When we rather eat food that we don't like or spend more money on something else. So thinking about that even further, what typically comes to mind when you think about giving feedback? Like for some people, it's like, I get this like weird feeling in my gut, like, it's going to be so uncomfortable. I'd rather just not do it. What do you find difficult about giving feedback? On the flip side, what was the most effective feedback you received and why was it so effective? And how do you feel about giving difficult feedback? And the reason why we want to go to first exploring our relationship is because no matter how many frameworks, no matter how many things you practice, the amount of times that you have a practice in the mirror, the amount of times you've studied a framework, none of that will matter unless you mentally come to terms with the fact that feedback is a gift and it's necessary. And it's not about you. I'm going to say that again. Feedback is not about you, it's about the other person. We don't give feedback because we feel uncomfortable. It's difficult for the person giving feedback to give feedback than the person receiving it. It's harder for you if you are delivering feedback to give the feedback than the person hearing it. If you think about anyone that you've had in the past, your teachers, sports coaches, if you were in an orchestra, whatever you were in, did you or did you not have somebody telling you when something wasn't going right? I have a story of my sixth grade teacher who, so I was transitioning from, I didn't speak English when I moved here to the US. And so I was in ESL classes, like English as second language, and, did that for a few years. Then English was okay, but was still learning the grammar. But my math was a little bit further ahead because I could translate that very easily. Math is math. So I was in this class with my sixth grade teacher who, for him, it was if you were in his accelerated math program, you also had to be part of his accelerated English program. And so we were doing these tests, and I distinctly remember that I would do really well in the math, but with the reading and the grammar, I was always really bad at it and spelling. And he sat with me, Mr. Levine. To this day, I still get an email from him every holiday. In fact, I just got one from him over Thanksgiving. Mr. Levine sits me down and goes, Foram, you're a smart kid. There's no reason why you should get anything less than 100 for spelling. There's one way to do it. It's right or wrong. It's just like a math problem. And I never want to see you get anything less than 100. I don't know what it was about him just telling me that, but I never got anything less than 100 after that. I needed him to tell me that I could be better and to point out something that maybe I knew of, but just needed that push. And that's what we do whenever we're giving feedback to somebody, or what someone else does when they're giving feedback to us. They're taking a minute, a moment to tell us something, to make us better. It's a gift. So until we can come to terms with feedback is a gift, it's there to help the other person, and I should accept it if I'm the one who's getting feedback because it's for my own good. Whether or not I do something about it, that's your decision. Only then will any of this other stuff make sense to you. So why is it so hard? For many reasons, like going back to the restaurant conversation, it's because we want to be liked. You don't want to be that jerk who's in the restaurant who's always like, excuse me, I don't like this temperature's off a little bit. Oh, this isn't crunchy enough. Oh, this is soggy. You don't want to be a pain in the ass. And or in the workplace, worse yet, Well, what if you piss off your peers? What if you have to give feedback to your manager? What if there are consequences to that? It's also awkward when you're about to have feedback. It's just easier to avoid it. Sometimes it's because we don't know how. We don't know how to do it. In some cases, it's because it's not part of our culture. We think we're hurting someone. That's a big reason that I hear often. I don't want to hurt you. How can I assess whether or not you're going to be hurt? I'm making that assumption by thinking that. And lastly, because we want to be nice. Pair this with the stat that we saw, where only 30% of people are getting the feedback that they need compared to the 60 who are asking for it. 70%. That math was bad. Mr. Levine would be very disappointed. So think about what your reason is first. And I urge you to then consider, how can you break the assumption? How can you test the assumptions that you have about your relationship with feedback? So, feedback is a gift. We give feedback to reinforce a behavior, like positive feedback, or to change a behavior, which is our constructive feedback. And we need both. It's not one or the other. Whenever, also, that's the other thing, is when I've been using the word feedback, I'm sure you're thinking about like the atomic bomb dropping of negative feedback. But feedback is positive and constructive. And we need both. We need both to do better, to be better, and to excel. I'm in the middle of potty training my 2.5-year-old. Am I learning the importance of reinforcement and positive feedback? I mean, even the smallest thing, the amount of, I probably shouldn't be doing this, but the amount of bribery of like, oh, you pulled your pants down, great, like here's a chocolate. I'm really proud of you, yay. I mean, it's like a circus in this house, the amount of cheering that we have to reinforce, to get her to do more of what she's doing, which is to be more independent. We actually do this all of the time. If you're a parent, it's a lesson in leadership on a daily basis. You're constantly giving feedback to your kids, positive and constructive. It's so easy for us to do that as a parent. Translate that to the workplace. Now we're going to shift a little bit and think about if you are the person who is delivering feedback to somebody at work. Your goal is to provide feedback in a way that the receiver, the person who's hearing the feedback, is most receptive to it. It is not okay to say, I just need to say it. And as soon as I say the feedback, I'm done and my job is over. That's not going to help anyone. That's just going to frustrate you. It's going to frustrate the other person. We have to do it in a way that the other person internalizes it and is receptive to it. So let's break that down. You as a sender provides feedback. The receiver processes the feedback, which leads to acceptance. They then interpret the feedback, which is the receptivity, which can lead to action. Whether or not they take action is on the receiver. But what we have to be in charge of is make sure that they at least get to acceptance. Have you ever been in a situation with your spouse or a friend where it doesn't matter what the other person has said, like you are in that mood where you have gotten so defensive that you can't even hear what the feedback is because you cannot accept it? I'm sure we all have those stories, right? Where it's so hard for us to receive it. Yep. That's what happens if we deliver feedback to another person or the receiver when they're not ready for it. And we'll talk about how to overcome it. But our job is to make sure that they accept it, because if they don't accept, there's no action. we're going to quickly go through this framework, and then I want to actually start talking about practicing it and what that looks like. So remember, our goal is to get somebody to ultimately to take action, but our first step is to make sure that they accept what we're saying. In order to do that, there's 5 steps that you want to follow. I would say the thing that people almost always skip is step number 1, which is reinforcing someone's identity. If people feel like they're being attacked, their personality is being attacked, their identity is being attacked, they will completely shut down. So what this looks like is, Jennifer, I know how important it is for you to build client relationships. Corey, I know how important it is for you to do really great work. Oh, Susan, that's great. Connect before you correct. Yes, absolutely. We have to make sure that's there, because otherwise people are not going to be vulnerable enough to accept. They will just have their guard up. So you want to reiterate someone's identity, something that's important to the other person. Then you go into providing context. Explain a time and place in which the behavior was observed, and be specific. Forum, when I know how important it is to really deliver good work. When we were in the meeting with stakeholders yesterday. Now I can imagine where I was. Then you want to describe the behavior. You seemed disengaged because you were answering emails with the stakeholders on the email. Okay. Explain the impact. By you focusing on something else while you're in a meeting with the stakeholders, it may seem like you're not prioritizing them. What do you think we can do differently next time? And this is where you're now thinking about the next behavioral change. So when you're going through this whole model, and this is not linear, sometimes there's different elements that can be added first or reversed, but you want to make sure that the most important thing is go back to why this feedback is even relevant to this individual. You know that it's really important for me to have strong relationships and to deliver good work. Okay, we've established that. Well, in the meeting, I wasn't delivering good work because I was diminishing the trust with my clients because I was doing something else, and they knew I was doing something else because I was emailing. And here's the impact that it could have. Now that I know this, I also need to plan for what I'm going to do differently. So I'm going to pause for a second. How many of you follow some sort of a framework or model like this? Feel free to put in the chat when you are giving feedback to others, and or you're getting feedback. You're the one who's receiving the feedback. How many of you get something like this? And as you're typing, I'm sure most of you are familiar with the shit sandwich. Jill, you're really good at this. Oh, and you really messed up at this meeting, but you did a really good job here. Oh, I like that. SBI, yep. Erin, when you say you talk too much, can you expand on that a little bit? And as more and more things are coming through the chat, emphasizing that the shit sandwich, positive, negative, positive, is not an effective way to deliver feedback. Because what you're doing is, one, you're diluting the message. The individual does not know what they're supposed to do. Like, okay, are you telling me I'm doing well? Am I not doing well? You don't want to ever confuse and or integrate too many pieces of feedback in one conversation. The reason why is because if you're doing that, that's probably what THANHLE said, the deer in the headlights, because the only feedback is the year end. You probably get shit sandwiches when you're doing a one-time feedback because you're not having conversations enough. And that confuses people because they don't know what to focus on. Ah, great, Erin. Thank you for sharing that, which is I make assumptions and try to explain for them why they may have behaved a certain way. Well, how might we change that? We might change that by asking or saying, well, what did you think of that meeting? How do you think we did? And we ask open-ended questions. Yes. We ask open-ended questions, not questions that start with why, like, why did you do this? Because why is very accusatory, and you're going to get some people who have to then defend their behavior. But rather, what you want to do is assess, where are they? Before I ever get feedback, I always start with, how do you think that went? Because I want to know, where are they in terms of their perception of what occurred. If they think, wow, that went really well, in my head, I'm like, wow, that was a disaster. I know then I have a lot more opportunity to educate them as to why I think it was a disaster, and or I need to pull and understand more from their perspective. Maybe something I missed. Maybe I'm wrong here. But you want to understand, where are you both in terms of alignment? Are you both talking on different spectrums as to how a situation occurred or what happened? And if so, then there's a lot more work to do to get in the middle before you can even start talking about behavioral changes. But if you're on the same page of like, oh, I think that could have been better, and here's what I'm thinking, then you can now expand on that through this feedback framework. How frustrating that your year-end, your feedback conversations keep getting canceled, right? That doesn't help you. Question. Okay, Leo says, I'm trying to end on a question such as, how did they see it? I might even begin on that question. How did you see it? What's your perspective? Before I give you my perspective, what's your perspective? This is great. I love the chats. Keep them coming. As we're going through this, shift a little bit. Think about someone that you need to provide feedback to, whether that is a direct team member, that's a peer, or it's your manager. Think about, I want you to visually just think about someone you need to have a conversation with. Jennifer, that's a really great question. Jennifer asked, what if we're totally misaligned? If that person is feeling really good and I think it went poorly, how can we not frame it as a gotcha moment? Great question. So if I were to role play that, let's say, Jennifer, if you and I are having a conversation and I say, well, Jennifer, how do you think that went? You're like, wow, that went really well. I'm like, okay, well, what do you think went well about it? Now I'm going to probe a little bit. What do you think went well about it? I'm going to listen to what they're saying. Great, I agree. Or, okay, like, thank you for sharing that perspective. What could be better? And I'm now going to ask that question too. What do you think could have been better? And I'm going to wait to hear what they say. Then I'm going to pivot the conversation, acknowledging what they've already said to me and say, okay, I hear you say that this went well. This could have been better. Now, here's my perspective on this from where I sat. And then I'll actually go into the feedback framework, which is the way I looked at it, and this was my point of view, is when you said this, or when we delivered this deck or deliverable to this client, I thought if they were more receptive to it, or if they really liked it, they would have executed on our recommendations right away. But that didn't occur, which leads me to believe that maybe we had more opportunity for improvement than we thought. Let's have that conversation. Exactly, Jennifer. We're trying to use their point of view to then pivot into where we want to go. And then also make sure that we're continuously using their perspective for the feedback. Otherwise, then the feedback becomes all about me. And feedback's not about you, it's about the other person. There are going to be times when you are giving feedback when you both totally disagree. In which case, and that's where it gets a little bit complicated. In which case, let's say if you're in a manager relationship and you're giving feedback to a direct report and they don't agree with you and there is no common ground. For example, if it's things like, the deliverable has to be this way. Like you think you included details, but I'm telling you, you did not, because I know what the client wants. Like there's a right or wrong to do something. Then it becomes less of a dialogue and more around, these are the things that have to change. So if it's a non-negotiable, just know that your action item or your call to action becomes more of a non-negotiable than what are we going to do about it? Let's keep going. Normally, we would spend a lot more time here doing a discussion, debrief, going through actual scenarios. Like Jennifer, you asked a really great question. So if you have other questions on what do you do when you have different perspectives or situations, please put that in the chat. But just thinking about what we've talked about so far, like your relationship with feedback, around the feedback framework, how to approach it if you are on two different sides. What are some of the things that you might want to start doing, stop doing, or continue? What is one takeaway that you have so far? And please put that in the chat. When I do these workshops, one thing that I often hear is just this sigh of relief that you're right. Feedback isn't about me, it's about the other person. Second one I hear often is the whole thought process around, hey, this is a lot harder for me than maybe the person who's hearing it, because we put so much pressure on it. And the fact that you're all on this webinar already shows that you're very cognizant of what you say and how you deliver the message. So what are some of the things that you all will start doing, or maybe stop doing? I'd love to see it. So we talked about how you deliver the feedback in the moment, but there's a lot of things that happen before and after. So the first one is, that's a good question. Any way to lay people off in a positive manner. So this actually shifts a little bit from a feedback conversation and more around, and we have a whole downloadable on this as well, and how to have these conversations. But you do it in a way that respects the person. So what I mean by that is, Foram, you've been, and to be very straightforward, you've been a very good, thank you for contributing to this organization. We are in a position where we have to cut down because of X, Y, and Z. Because of that, unfortunately, we have to let you go. Here are the ways that we would like to support you in your transition out. So usually it's like outplacement, some sort of a severance package and all of that. Should things change, we would love to revisit, and whether that's creating an alumni directory, whatever you can do as an organization. And that's it. And you keep it short and simple. So we really appreciate your contributions and we wish things were different. And you say it like a headline, just like how, the worst headlines in the newspaper, it's just there. It's simple, it's direct. It hurts, but it's simple and it's direct. And we don't want to overcompensate. We don't want to over talk. We don't want to overly apologize, because that individual has a lot going on. There's probably a lot of thoughts in their heads. So they probably just need to know, what does this mean for me? What is the next step? Keep it simple and concise. Thank you for asking. Going back to the actual feedback conversations that we have, there's a lot that we can do to prepare. The thing about feedback is that the more you do it, the easier that it gets. Even to this day, it's still really hard for me to have feedback conversations, especially when I know that the person is trying really hard, or I know that they mean well. It's like, man, I don't want to be like beat them down about it, because I know they mean well. I know they're trying really hard, but it's still my responsibility to provide the feedback. So the more you prepare, the easier it gets. Then think about your worst case and the best case scenario. Sometimes, depending on the person, you may say, best case scenario, they will be like, yes, thank you so much for telling me, and they're on top of it. Worst case scenario, they get pissed and they start to yell, or they withdraw and they get very quiet on you. What are you going to do? What are you going to do if they go completely silent? What are you going to do if they get very defensive? And prepare for that. The more mentally you can prepare, the better it is. My 2 cents, if I know someone is likely to get defensive, I will actually say that before I even start the feedback conversation. I know this is going to be really hard to hear. This is going to be really hard to hear. And this may not be a pleasant conversation. And I'll go into the feedback. If it's still getting into a defensive mode, there might be yelling, I will say, let's regroup when you've had a moment. When's a good time to talk so we can have a dialogue calmly? If someone withdraws, I will ask them questions, open-ended questions, to start to engage them a little bit more. Or I will say, do you want some time to process this? Should we meet tomorrow, but this time to discuss how we move forward? Now it's the expectation that we're going to talk about what we're doing about it, not to stay silent. Practice the conversation with people. It's one thing to have it in your head. It's another to write it down. It's another when you actually say it out loud. And then commit to a goal on how often you're going to give feedback. Even positive feedback, you cannot just give it so generically and say, good job. It should be well thought out and very specific. And don't give feedback just to give feedback, right? You don't want to be that person either where it doesn't mean anything. There was a story or research that was done with these 2 groups of children. They were in kindergarten. And group 1 and group 2, they both had to draw buses. And with group 1 of the children, they said, wow, that's a really nice window. I really like the way you drew your wheels. With the second group, they said, good job. You're a great artist. So then they had them draw again. And this time they said, oh, to group 1, you're missing some wheels on that bus. Oh, you're missing a door. You're missing headlights. With the second group, same feedback. You're missing wheels. You're missing headlights. You're missing a door. The first group was like, oh, Okay, yeah, I'm just going to draw in my wheels. The second group said, oh, I'm a really bad artist. Maybe I shouldn't draw anymore. And they just gave up. The difference with how they delivered the feedback to the first group and the second group. The first group, they were very specific. They gave context. With the second group, they said, you're a good artist. They made it about the personality and more about the identity. Things that cannot be changed. Feedback is meant for behavioral changes, things that we can control and pivot on. So if we say, good job, you're a good person. Wow, that was really lazy. That doesn't help anyone. And what you're going to notice is people are going to withdraw and think that they can't change. Last thing on the preparation is make sure you're preparing feedback in your style. And what I mean by that is think about the way that you need to do preparation. Are you the type of person that has to write it all down and make sure you have every single bullets just written in front of you, you've practiced it? Are you the type of person who just needs to record it or just do it on the spot as long as you have a high level overview of what that looks like? What do you need to be comfortable delivering the feedback? Then it's time to deliver the feedback. Make sure it's timely. Timely doesn't always mean immediate. And what I mean by immediate, it's not right after a meeting when someone might just be exhausted and you can see clearly they're distraught. After I'm done with a big meeting, if I think that I bombed it, that's not the right time to talk to me because I'm just replaying the meeting over and over again. So that's not helpful because I'm going to have a hard time processing. Timely means somewhere around like 48 hours to 72 hours. You're not waiting months where they're like, I have no idea what you're talking about. Think about when the person is in a calm and in a good headspace, right? Again, if I'm like dealing with emergencies and you're like, hey, Foram, do you have time for some feedback? Like, probably not the right time. Of course, if it's absolutely critical, it makes sense. But just think about and assess where the other person is and ask them if you don't know. I mean, that's kind of the hard part about being virtual right now is we can't see all the faces all the time if we're on the phone. So just ask them. Would right now be a good time for feedback? Be aware of feedback fatigue. Remember, you're not overcorrecting where you're giving feedback at every single moment. My favorite is being thoughtful about progress versus preference. Are you giving feedback because you have a preference, which means there's no right or wrong way of doing it? It's just your way. Or are you giving feedback because that's going to progress the other person in whatever work that they're doing? If it's preference based, it's probably best to maybe not give the feedback unless it's going to make your life a lot easier and it's dramatically going to change things. Try to give feedback on progress based things. It used to drive me nuts when one of my managers during my consulting times used to give me all this feedback. He would tear my decks apart, absolutely tear them apart, because he's like, I don't like Arial. I like Times New Roman. And I don't like this table. I like this table instead. I don't like this graph. I like this graph instead. It was all preference based. And it would drive me insane because it's like, okay, so am I doing something that's going to change the quality of this presentation? No. Have I forgotten content that would be important for the stakeholders? No. This was just about what he liked. And it would drive me nuts. And I would then start to just get a little, I would get really frustrated with him because I just thought that it was just like nitpicky and naggy. So whenever he had feedback, I didn't take it as seriously. It's like, oh, there he goes again. Deliver it in private when we can, when we're not in COVID. Do it best in person if you can. But finally, the most important thing is provide the feedback in the receiver's style. So remember when we were preparing for the feedback, we're doing it in a way that we needed to prepare, right? Whether that's writing it all down, practicing it, having some high level themes, whatever it is. But when I'm delivering the feedback, I need to do it in a way that's going to resonate with the other person. Because remember, going back to what is that model? What is a process for feedback? I want to make sure that they're receptive to it. So in order for me to do it in a way of the receiver, I would want to ask, how do you like to get feedback? Do you like written documentation afterwards? Is it casual? Is it formal? Are we doing formal meetings or is it more casual? Are we walking around? Are we doing it via phone, via Zoom? What does all of that look like to you? I was doing this workshop. Jennifer, good question. Very strong recommendation to do it via video over the phone. And the reason being is there are things that you cannot see on the phone that you can see on video. For example, if you're giving me feedback and I all of a sudden start to cross my arms or I look down and I get disengaged, that would be your cue to say, what's going on? Is this not resonating? Right? You can probe that, which you can see via video. So highly recommend video over phone. You're welcome. I was delivering this workshop and a client was like, said, you know, this was again pre-COVID. I was on my smoke break. My manager decides to come during my smoke break and decides to give me feedback because she thought that would be the right time to give it. She's like, I was so mad and so upset that was my time to disconnect and do my thing, that I don't even remember what the feedback is. And to this day, I still don't know what it was because I was just so upset by the situation. So just keep that in mind. Keep in mind who you're giving the feedback to and how you're doing it and what their preference is. And if you don't know, ask. Okay, let's say we've done our due diligence, we've prepared for it, we go through the framework, we deliver it in a way that makes sense. Do not assume that it's done. Don't assume what the other person heard. Make sure that you are both on the same page. And the way you do that is you ask about next steps. Okay, Corey, so what are next steps coming out of our conversation now? What was your biggest takeaway from this conversation? What are we going to do differently? When are we going to do it by? How will you hold yourself accountable? What can I do to support you? You want to make sure that there's good checks and balances in place because the real work happens after the feedback delivery because that's where you're looking for the behavioral change. And that's the hardest part. So you just want to make sure that there's clear alignment and they've understood what your message is. Because if they haven't understood the message, then you have to go back and try again. Let's say I'm the one who's getting feedback. So you are giving me feedback. It should be my responsibility to also show understanding. If you haven't been through, agreed, sometimes managers just do this to check the box. And if you agree with the feedback, then perhaps you can then take ownership of that. And here's what I would do. Put yourself in the other person's shoes. Why and what might be their intention? Like what motivates somebody to take 20 minutes to give you feedback when they could just avoid it the whole time? Clearly there's some motivation because they either want to see you succeed, they want to see the team succeed, they want to see the organization succeed, whatever it is. Try to understand their perspective. Then you thank them for the feedback. Thank you for your feedback. So if I hear you're telling me it would be best if one of what I'm clearly taking away here is that I could do a much better job of making sure that I'm being present. And that means not having my Slack open and emails and, really staying fully engaged, at times chiming in with what I've heard. And that's what I'm going to do moving forward. So we have 3 meetings next week. My commitment is to do that in the next 3 meetings. When we meet again, let's debrief and make sure that I have implemented your feedback. So now I'm taking full ownership. I've heard you, I've thanked you, I've told you what I'm going to do differently. Okay, there's a lot there. I would argue that it's harder to give feedback to our peers and our managers than direct reports if we have direct reports. So, something to think about is just think about what challenges that you face when you are talking to your peers and managers, and consider, well, what are the differences truly? Is it because you're afraid of repercussions? Is it because of going back to our relationship with feedback and why it's so hard for us? Is it because we don't want our peers to think that we're a know it all? What exactly is holding us back? Once you can identify that, then think about how you're going to test those assumptions. All right. It is, though, our responsibility to give feedback to our peers and our managers, because we all have a responsibility to the organization that we work with and our teams. Assume positive intent. Talk about it. Talk about how you want to give each other feedback. Ask your manager, how would you like to receive feedback? What is the best way to do that? And try to hold each other accountable on what that looks like. The takeaway here is people want to know, have you ever been that person who has like food in your teeth and you've walked around all day in every meeting with food in your teeth and you're like, why didn't anyone tell me? That's happened to me. People want to know. People want to know, people want to know, people want to know. Don't be the reason why people leave the organization because they just want feedback and we don't feel comfortable giving it, so therefore we just keep it to ourselves. Okay, to recap, how do you see these things working for you? What are the things that you might want to incorporate? There's a lot that we covered. I mean, I spent 9 months studying feedback and there was still so much to learn. This is a crash course on what that is. So what is that one thing that you're taking away from today, and what do you want to do differently? And this is just the beginning of how coaching works. When we're engaging in coaching, it's about taking those real-time scenarios like, I have to let people go. How do I do that? My manager always cancels on me. How do I have a conversation with my manager on making sure that they're taking the time to invest in me? These are real things that we work on through our coaching time together. So truly go back and think about how you may want to consider coaching for yourself, whether that's an investment you're making or you're going to your organization and asking them for budget and saying, I would like to be sponsored, and here's how that's going to help us as an organization, and here's how it's going to help me as an individual. We are offering free 30-minute strategy sessions just to 3 people. This is going to be your time to have a one-on-one with me to go through where you're at, to think about how you can take any roadblocks, challenges, and build some action around it. Jill will send over the link on how to schedule time with me to do that. I would love an opportunity to connect and think about what that looks like for you. I can tell you a lot changed for me when I started getting coaching. I didn't know what coaching was at all. And I remember after the first session with Terry, who was my coach at the time, I'm like, how did you do that? I've been through so many trainings in my life, because you have to, but never once have I taken a training to that level where I saw impact right away. So that was really cool for me. I love Oprah. Absolutely love Oprah. Just think about it that way. You get feedback, you get feedback. Everyone gets feedback because it is a gift. And that's the best thing that you can do. So we have 4 minutes, ooh, go me, to open it up to discussion and questions. And thank you for the feedback so far and the comments.
I love that you celebrated yourself. Congratulations. Go me. I love it. Yeah, so much amazing feedback. This was really, really helpful for everyone.
Thank you for the feedback on the feedback, you guys.
Yeah. All right. Well, if anyone else, if you have any questions, please feel free, put them in the chat. We know that with so much goodness in 1 hour, it's a lot to take on. So if you have any questions that come later as you digest and process all of this, Forum is on that email that I sent out before, and we'll also send out a recap that includes this recording, some of those resources that Forum shared as well. So if you have any questions, please go ahead and schedule that strategy session with Forum. I'll post the link one more time. So that way you can actually really get into the good stuff of what you really need. And so that's it. Thank you all so much for coming. And we still have 2 minutes, so open to questions. Otherwise, feel free to reply to that email. There's humans behind that, so we're happy to answer those if you have any.
Yes, recording coming your way.
Yeah, absolutely. Wonderful.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah. Thanks to Forum. Lovely. Great.
Yeah.
Love it. I love that. I love the beginning when everyone comes in, and then at the end when everyone's really excited. Great information. Yes. Thank you all so much. This was wonderful. All right. Making sure we got all questions answered.
I think so.
Great. Yep. You're good. This was awesome. We might need to put this back on the schedule for 2021.
Down.
Yeah. Much needed. I think we just all need these constant reminders of feedback. Always refreshing just to understand the process and the ins and outs of it a little bit more.
My favorite is when I try to give feedback to my husband. He goes, "Don't pull your feedback sessions on me."
He knows.
You're right. You're right. Let's just cut this shit. You messed up. You messed up, buddy. So just know when sometimes this framework is not applicable in your personal household.
That is true. Still good to have, of course. All right, everyone. He's a guinea pig for your work. Exactly. There you go. Awesome. All right, everyone. Well, we're at time. Look at that, right on the dot. So thank you all so much for joining. Please take advantage of those strategy sessions. It's so valuable to have that one-on-one time, especially with Forum. So the special little bonus for today. So thank you all so much. If you have any other questions, feel free to reach out, and we hope to see you guys on future webinars as well.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.